So it's 6 o'clock here, so I figured I'd go ahead and get started. Let me begin by just thanking all of you for logging in and taking the time to share an evening with me and Lincoln University and the Missouri River Regional Library System. We're all very proud to continue to bring this this lecture series to you. Obviously, like many in the United States and around the world right now, we've had to make some adjustments, and so the adjustment we've made is to try and offer these things virtually. Because we believe that even in this period of social distancing, it's important that we continue to try and engage each other as a community and discuss the topics and issues that affect all of us. And I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag if I say that I think right now most of America is trying to deal with coronavirus and its impacts on our daily lives. And so this presentation is intended to discuss coronavirus from the perspective of how it's impacting our social and political fabric. It's based upon an article that I published a couple of weeks ago in medium.com entitled The COVID Conundrum. And ultimately, it is going to be focusing on a key question. And that key question is, well, before I get to the key question, I actually like to take time usually and throw down some disclaimers, just so everyone understands what the ground rules are. And before we get into discussion, we have some understanding of how it is we're trying to engage each other. The first ground rule for me, and I think it's particularly important with regards to this discussion, is that I love to debate, but I also try and avoid as much as possible arguments. And to me, the real difference is whether or not you go into the discussion with a real intent to listen to what other people are saying, and at least the possibility that your preconceived notions or understandings of the topic might be wrong. I'm not trying to change anyone's minds. I'm just literally trying to get a lot of different aspects of the discussion out there, because whether it's coronavirus or politics in America more generally, I think that we are often overcome by our own biases and prejudices to the point that we're not listening to the other side. And so one of my goals, hopefully, is to try and promote civil discussion so that everyone has an opportunity to engage and to consider what's being said by all sides. One of the things that has to be recognized is that whenever you're doing political or social discussions, it's almost impossible to avoid generalizations. It is, whether we're talking about all Republicans or all Democrats or liberals or conservatives, the reality is that generalizations are one way that we can kind of package these discussions in a way that we can then understand them and unpackage them later on and apply them to our own lives. But whether it's coronavirus or any of the other issues that, kind of are the foundation of American politics today, it's also important to recognize that generalizations can be dangerous. I know, for instance, that when it comes to coronavirus in particular, I think there are an enormous number of generalizations and broad assumptions that are being taken by people at all levels, whether you're at the highest levels of government or just an individual person working in a small business, or even a student or a professor at a university. We're all kind of being impacted not just by our own assumptions and generalizations, but by those around us. And so, again, I'm not going to suggest that I can avoid them here, but at the same time, I did think it was important to understand that I'm not trying to make blanket statements about all of society. I think in the end, it's just more of a trying to identify the majority or the dominant perspectives. Lastly, it's important to understand that I operate on the belief that there's a fundamental difference between criticizing and critiquing, and that difference is offering a solution. I think one of the things that has kind of typified the entire debate and discussion surrounding coronavirus is how much a variety of different people on all sides have kind of devolved to criticizing. And I think at least part of that is the political culture and atmosphere of America today. But I would argue at least part of that is also driven by the very nature of coronavirus as a threat to the United States. And more importantly, kind of the lack of information that is available in a variety of different areas of the coronavirus pandemic that we really feel like we need. And so I think a lot of people have tended to maybe And for lack of a solution, you look for a source of the problem. And if you can't find one, you make one up. And I kind of want to try and avoid that as part of our discussion this evening, no matter how much certain aspects of this discussion might actually end up focusing on an individual, say, for instance, Trump. So another disclaimer that's important for me to throw out there is that I am not telling anybody how to think. I think if there is one issue today that is more polarizing than perhaps even we expected it to be or imagined it could be, it's this coronavirus thing. And I'm not even beginning to try and tell anyone out there what to think, because that would somehow it would give the impression that I know. And I know about as much as the rest of you in terms of testing information from media sources and reports and science. And all I'm trying to offer here is a framework for thinking about these things. The conclusions that you come to are still your own, and I respect them. In the end, these are my observations, arguments, and conclusions. They don't reflect either the opinions of Lincoln University or the Missouri River Regional Library System and the lecture series. And once again, I do really very much appreciate the opportunities for me to engage this lecture with you and to engage you on this topic. My own biases. Well, I guess to begin with, some of the biases I have to consider are, first, I'm in central Missouri right now. And why does that matter? Because, well, one of the things that we're going to discuss is that the experiences and thus perceptions of the virus are radically different across the United States. They differ according to urban versus rural communities. They differ according to states and population densities, and they differ across regions, not just because of the way in which the virus has impacted those areas, but ultimately because of the way in which those areas have been responding to the virus. And so I would be remiss if I did not mention that my personal experience has been driven, for instance, by how it's impacted my university and my students. It's been driven by living in Missouri as opposed to, for instance, California or New York. And ultimately, I have to be honest, it's driven by my pre-existing concerns and issues regarding leadership in the United States. And so, again, I just want a full disclosure and lay out that I have my own biases coming into this, and I'm not pretending to present some wholly objective understanding of what's going on today. I'm presenting my understanding, and hopefully you'll find it enjoyable.
Darius Watson, go ahead.
Hello? Oh, if you could just do me a favor and mute your mic. The way this is going to work, I think probably the best way to do this is I'm just going to kind of try and do each individual slide. And then after each slide, I figured if you guys have a question, just type question into the chat and then unmute and ask the question. I figured that'd probably be the best way to do it. And so, speaking of questions, everything for me began with the first couple of weeks of trying to digest what was going on with coronavirus and the growing pandemic in the United States. Full disclosure, I would love to tell you that somehow I was fully apprised of everything going on, that I was fully engaged with the news cycle and trying to get everything I could. The truth is that the week after my school had to shut down campus for coronavirus, I found myself kind of deer in the headlights, not really knowing, not just unable to fully understand what was going on, but perhaps more importantly, I kind of found myself unable to figure out. Hi, Robert. Once I recognize your question, then maybe I can switch over to your video so that we can see you. Sorry. So for me, the immediate response to the pandemic was one of just kind of searching for a base, trying to figure out where to start in terms of developing my own reactions and understandings of what was going on. And so the first thing that jumped out at me, and ultimately the reason behind this entire presentation, was the question that developed in my head of why are we rallying around the flag? For me, everything I understand as a national emergency really begins with 9/11, because that's the most direct personal experience I have. And so I can't help but at least try on some level to make comparisons between how we're reacting to the coronavirus and how we reacted to 9/11, especially again as it relates to rallying around the flag or that creation of a patriotic communal coming together as a nation to confront and then and overcome what we see as a shared threat. And so again, why isn't this taking place? And I guess to be clear, that's a theoretical assumption on my part. I suppose there would be some people that would argue that in fact America is coming together under the coronavirus, but my assumption or my theoretical argument would be that we're not, and that there are a variety of different pieces of evidence that suggest that we are having significant difficulty coming together and rallying around the flag in this moment in the same way that we did following, say, the attacks on 9/11, or frankly, any number of other significant threats to U.S. security and our culture during our history. So for me, it begins with understanding coronavirus itself as a national threat, and more importantly, understanding that the coronavirus is not a traditional threat to the United States. Now, what do I mean by traditional? Well, first and foremost, it's not a physical attack. And I think that in and of itself has caused certain levels of confusion with regards to how the United States would normally respond to these things. We kind of have a normal response in terms of initial kind of horror and mourning of the lost. And then it's kind of replaced by an anger and a search for the enemy, and ultimately a path towards justice or retribution of some sort. And then finally, after that, there's some sort of, okay, who's responsible for enabling this, and how can we make sure it doesn't happen again? And so one of the aspects I'm going to discuss is the degree to which coronavirus has been a slow motion 9/11. Because of the pace in which it's unfolded, it has caused a real change in the way in which the nation responds to these sorts of threats. And I think the change in and of itself is significant in terms of how it's impacting the political culture of the country. The reality is I think that there are some national pre-existing conditions that have impacted America's coming together, or a tendency to normally come together during these periods of time. The pre-existing conditions that I kind of want to discuss is the pre-existing conditions that I want to discuss are regionalism, inequality, the concept of individual liberty versus the public good, and the concept of declining leadership. For a variety of different ways, I think these were, for a variety of different ways, I think that these are all aspects of American political culture that pre-existed coronavirus. Part of my argument is that, for better or for worse, in most other threats to national security or the national health of the United States, we see these things subverted, at least to a degree, for the common good. So if there was no distinction, for instance, during 9/11, that the attack took place in New York and Washington, every American felt compelled to not only feel sympathy and actually feel like we had been targeted, but every American also felt the need to respond, and if need be, sacrifice to kind of almost have a shared sense of loss with those that had directly felt 9/11 in Manhattan and DC and in Pennsylvania. And so for me, it's that sort of thing that is so clearly missing from a response to coronavirus that led me to think further about the overall political impacts of the virus itself. Finally, the presentation is going to conclude with just a brief discussion and hopefully open discussion of the future. Specifically, I think coronavirus is going to have a long-term impact in two ways. First, by resetting the foundations of the 2020 election. I've written an article in the past about how I felt the 2020 election, even before the coronavirus, was the most important election of my lifetime. And in fact, I think all coronavirus has done is narrow the field of issues that could potentially affect the election to the point that now it's an all or nothing about Trump's leadership during the coronavirus epidemic. And when you take that into, when you consider that in association with the reality that the United States really in many ways has abdicated the concept of global leadership during this pandemic, I think that the future, both domestically and internationally, is potentially radically different than what we understand it now. Are there any initial questions or comments before I move to the first slide? Hopefully I'm not moving too fast. Okay. So the first part of the discussion, as I said, a lot of my kind of theoretical or academic, whatever term you want to use, understanding coronavirus really has to begin with my experiences in 9/11. It should be noted again that part of my academic background is as a security professor. And so I really, after 9/11, I really kind of threw myself into the study of international terrorism and international security, even more than I had previously. And so the first difference that jumps out at me with regards to understanding traditional threats and responses within the United States relative to coronavirus is that coronavirus didn't have that initiating event. It did not have the planes into the building moment that everyone can see and view the same way. It really crept up on us. It really crept up to the point that as it's been happening, it's allowed different people to define it in different ways. And that in turn has allowed for a much greater level of politics, at least contentious politics, into what would normally be stages almost totally focused on mourning and dealing with the immediate aftermath of the threat or the event. And so the first thing that I think is important, it's almost like, you know, I mean, for 9/11, the reality is the fuses were lit when the people got on the planes in Boston and New York, and the bomb exploded and the fragments were spread around DC and Manhattan by noon. The event itself was done, and we could already begin kind of compartmentalizing that and moving on to the next part of our response and reaction. That's not happening here. There is no clear separation between the event itself and how we're supposed to respond. And so in my mind, that's a really key part of the murky waters and the political contest over how to respond. Another aspect is the reality is that 9/11 was simple for America to understand, as simple as Pearl Harbor. And that's because there was both a clear enemy and a clear cause. It was not hard to understand, and for most people, who attacked us and why they attacked us. We might not have agreed, we might thought it was rational or whatever, but in terms of basic understanding, we could trace from origin to initiation how we had gotten to this point. I think one of the things that's talked about at times, but in the end, it can't be underestimated, is how much the impeachment process really undermined the first 4 to 6 weeks of response time in the terms of the national focus on the growing threat. And so what we see here is a real continuing struggle to identify an enemy and a cause. I mean, even as late as today, there's continuing discussions of whether or not the virus originated in a Wuhan lab, whether or not it was genetically engineered or an accident. The lack of a clear enemy, the lack of a clear origination or cause, and the slow unfolding pace of the event have all allowed politics to enter into certain stages of American response that I would argue normally don't exist. And that immediate response is normally military. We don't tend to have these large-scale socio-political threats to the United States. And so in many ways, this is uncharted water, I would argue, for not just Americans and individual communities, but for the federal government as well. And the last point to make here about differences or why the differences between coronavirus and 9/11 might be impacting the nature of politics is because of the diffused area of impact. I think, again, as the picture to the left there kind of signifies, it doesn't matter really who you are or where you were in the United States at the time. Anyone that sees that picture of the World Trade Center understands immediately what we're referring to. What is the picture that represents coronavirus? I mean, for the first 4 weeks, it was a Carnival cruise ship. And then for another 4 weeks, it was masked hospital personnel. So I think all of these things have kind of lined up to really shift the nature of the coronavirus threat away from traditional frameworks of American understanding of what a threat is. And unfortunately, that means it's shifted us away from traditional frameworks of response to threats. Questions? John, go ahead. I think you guys should be able to unmute yourself. If there's a problem, I can step in.
Yes, Darius, thank you. You're talking about it as a non-traditional threat. How much conversation has there been about it as kind of an opportunity? You know, it occurring so close to election time. How much of it kind of plays into almost election strategy, to speak of it in a morbid way?
Well, I guess I'm not sure. I would have to separate. So, how the impact of the coronavirus and the responses to the coronavirus play out as a issue or tool within the national election is one issue, as opposed to individuals who I think fairly, unfairly, I should say, individuals who are engaging perhaps conspiracy theories regarding the origins of the virus, to the point that arguing that somehow it was engineered by one group to affect the political fortunes of another group. That's kind of where I would have to draw the line, but again, that's just me. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. It's just interesting. You know, you spoke about the creation of those conspiracy theories, and that's something that you've talked about in the past as far as fake news and its use in the political process.
Well, it's not really a primary theme of this discussion, but I would argue that conspiracy theories often find the most fertile ground in those situations where we're lacking information, and whether by design or simply because it's not available. And I think with regards to everything from testing to decision-making processes at the highest levels, to infection rates and death rates, I think the lack of information across the board with regards to coronavirus has only emboldened many of these conspiracy theories. Some people may forget, there were some rather fantastical conspiracy theories being floated after 9/11, to the point that I remember the National Geographic Channel had to put out an hour special doing nothing but debunking the conspiracy theories. And so that would unfortunately be one similarity between this event and 9/11.
Careful, you're talking to a truther here.
That's a different presentation. I'm not going there.
Me neither.
Listen, I like I said, I have this has been a real eye-opener for me, this entire experience with the coronavirus on multiple levels: professional, personal, academic. And so I don't begrudge anyone their perspectives and beliefs on what's going on right now, but I have to say that I don't necessarily agree with a lot of them, and find some of them to actually be dangerous. But again, that's a separate presentation. Going on with this idea that coronavirus is a slow motion 9/11. Again, in my mind, I ask you to envision somebody lighting the fuse on a stick of dynamite, and everything you've ever seen in movies, how long it takes the fuse to burn down, and then the dynamite explodes and there's the destruction all around. I would argue that if coronavirus is a stick of dynamite, it's going to take 9 to 12 months to fully explode. And so imagine what you do and don't do as you're standing there watching the wick burn down, watching it explode in slow motion. And I think ultimately what it does is it messes up your normal reaction cycles. America's normal reaction cycle to events like this begins with shock and mourning, or at least, excuse me, relative to 9/11, it did. There is a very clear moment immediately following the event where we're shocked and asking ourselves, how could this have happened? How could they do this to us? I believe the phrasing after 9/11, the exact phrasing was, why do they hate us? And then it's followed immediately by a mourning and a recognition of the damage that has been done. It does not take long, at least not normally for the United States and American culture, to then shift to anger and a search for justice. In 9/11, it was very clear. We knew within days that we would be heading to Afghanistan and focusing on the Taliban and their support of Al-Qaeda as a clear path to justice after 9/11. And as things progress, as that stage 2 progresses, then what you start to get is stage 3, the slow development of a post-mortem and a focus on preventing the next attack. And I said that way for a particular reason, because again, if people forget after 9/11, for years following 9/11, the assumption was that it's only a matter of time before there's another one. And so the post-mortem and preventing the next attack phase, you see this sort of dual approach of first trying to identify the failures or mistakes that were made that enabled or allowed the attack to happen in the first place, while simultaneously putting in place the various mechanisms to make sure it doesn't happen again. See the 9/11 report. See the longstanding debate and ultimate reversal of the Patriot Act. My argument here is that one of the most significant impacts of the coronavirus, particularly the pace of the coronavirus, is that it is forcing America to engage all 3 of these stages at the same time, rather than sequentially. Literally at the same time we have Americans mourning the loss of loved ones due to the COVID and coronavirus outbreak, we have other individuals who are angry at the responses and are seeking justice, be it people on the right who are seeking justice from what they believe to be a failure of leadership from the Trump administration, on the left, excuse me, or people on the right who are angry at China and seeking justice, potential justice from them. This is happening at the same time as we are trying to understand the slowly unfolding shock of the event and then deal with mourning those who are being lost. And one of the impacts of this is that you start to see those emotions become intertwined in a damaging way, in my opinion, especially when you add in the third stage, and that is, not just the postmortem, but preventing the next attack. We're literally having people debate over whether there will be a next attack. How big will it be? We are not able to sequentially look at these things in such a way as we're able to take the information and experiences from the previous stage to then make better and more rational decisions in the current stage. So we're reacting with the anger and just search for justice while we're still upset and shocked and mourning those that we've lost. In the end, one of the things that I think is going to be really important to engage, especially as it relates to the 2020 election, is the idea that there's a much higher possibility of a quote unquote another coronavirus than there ever was of another 9/11. And not only is there a much higher possibility of another wave of coronavirus, it's more than possible that it will take place while we're still recovering from this one. And so in my mind, the next president, whoever he is going to be able to deal not just with the recovery, but preparing and perhaps dealing with the next one. And a lot of that preparation and decision-making is going to revolve around longstanding debates over the social safety net in America. The reality is that one of the key differences between coronavirus and 9/11 is that 9/11 really focused almost exclusively on a military security response. The response to coronavirus is going to require broad social, political, and economic policies and initiatives, many of which are at the root of some of the most critical debates in America today. So, yeah, to me, I think it's important to look at coronavirus not just for its similarities in terms of being a threat to the national conscience or national security, but I think it's almost more important to look at it in terms of its differences and how those differences are impacting standing structures and systems for U.S. response to these sorts of events.
Hey, Darius, can I
Yes.
ask a question?
Please.
I wrote this out because I think it might kind of, I hope it clarifies some issues. Here's the question, actually, I'm reading it. Darius, do you agree that not only has the coronavirus revealed our government's inability to protect us on important matters, it's also revealed capitalism to be the psychopathic enterprise it has always been? And frankly, that's what I think is behind this whole push to open the open markets, to open the stores and all that kind of business. Anyway, I'd really appreciate your comments or anyone else's comments on that question. Thanks.
Sure. No, I mean, I guess, to me, and again, I try and kind of deconstruct things. So for me, when I look at the government relative to coronavirus, and I will talk about this on an upcoming slide here. When I think of the government in response or dealing with coronavirus, I actually think of it in terms of a couple of different kind of considerations. The first consideration is, of course, capacity to react. The second one is willingness. And the third, quite frankly, and it's a theme that I've put out there in previous discussions of mine, I really am hesitant, and in fact, I try and avoid as much as possible conflating individual leaders or representatives or politicians with the government. What the government is designed to do and how it is then used to do those things are two different considerations in my mind. And so whether or not the government was prepared to deal with this, whether or not the government has responded, and how the government should be responding are distinctly different questions in my mind, some of them political and some of them technical. Relative to the issue of capitalism, that's a whole nother presentation almost. I guess in the end, all I'll say is, as much as when we look at capitalism within the United States, I really think it is absolutely vital to balance both the ills of capitalism with the advantages. The mere fact that we all have decent computers, we're all sitting here with camcorders, probably hopefully in nice houses, there's cars in it, that's all an aspect of capitalism. The reality is that capitalism in many ways is the foundation of everything America is, both for better and for worse. And trust me when I tell you, I am no fan of inequality, but I would be lying if I said that I don't appreciate the impetus of the American dream and the drive and the things that we've done as a result of that. I really look at capitalism in America as a double-edged sword. I would love to just say that, inequality is the be-all, end-all, and so we should go in and change the system fundamentally. But everything I've studied, all the variety of different ways that people have tried to engage economic systems, the truth is that every economic system has its problems. And so I'm not sure, as problematic as capitalism can be, and as much as coronavirus may have exposed those inequalities, something that I will also talk about, I'm not sure there's necessarily an alternative as much as a need to mitigate. I guess that would be the best way to put it.
So, well, if I can just interject, and
Yes.
don't object to me interjecting. I think, our response, Trump's response, whatever, is unequivocally the worst response basically in the world. I mean, we're probably maybe a little under Brazil's response in terms of coronavirus denial sort of business. But I mean, I think this has really, your idea that, or your mention that capitalism, the discussion about capitalism is irrelevant to this, I think it precisely relates to this because, for example, the exact points that Bernie was talking about, healthcare, debt forgiveness.
Well, no, I don't believe I ever said capitalism was irrelevant. I think it's extremely relevant. And again, as you can see on this slide, I believe that economics and inequality, as obviously associated with capitalism, are essential to consider. What I'm arguing is that there's not an absolute answer. It's not just we need to fix capitalism and everything will be great. If you start changing aspects of the capitalist system, you have to understand that you might be trading certain weaknesses or failures of the system for new ones. That's all I'm suggesting.
Yeah, Scandinavia has done it very successfully. I don't think that's a problem at all. Anyway, but I'll...
Okay, if I can just say, and this has to be put out there, I really don't think it's fair to especially quantitatively compare the United States and the majority of its data associated with coronavirus, whether it's responses or infection rates or anything else, with almost any other country in the world. Frankly, I just think it's an unfair comparison. So Scandinavia, you mentioned, we could talk about population, all right, and population size, but that's just one component of it. Look at area, the ability to close down borders, the relative systems that were already in place beforehand. For instance, one of the most critical aspects that's differentiating the U.S. response from every other country in the world is our federal system. That alone kind of creates a completely different dynamic and makes it difficult to compare us. For instance, I've heard comparisons to Taiwan and South Korea. I mean, to compare the U.S. response to a less democratic island nation with a homogenous population just doesn't seem to me to be a fair comparison. Again, just my opinion. But when you look at data and statistics, and it's not just the comparisons, it's the assumptions and conclusions people are drawing from those comparisons. Whether it's, the United States has failed or our leadership is,
I would make it a normative comparison in terms of what the way it would work as opposed to the way it has worked. I mean, I don't think there's any expert in the world that is not extremely critical of the way we've handled it. Now, you want to tie it to Trump, the Democrats, or whatever, but our response has been abysmal in comparison to most other countries, but also in a normative comparison to also the way it should be.
Well, again, and I'm going to keep moving. I really need to bring out the point that we're assuming the United States ever had the ability to respond like those countries. I mean, some of those countries you're talking about, for instance, have one of the significant tools that they've used is location data sourcing and apps to track individuals who have either tested positive or are suspected to have coronavirus, and then using that to further trace. And no matter how successful that is, the nature of American culture, I find it impossible to consider the idea of widespread use of tracking apps to help limit the spread of coronavirus. I'm not saying it wouldn't be good, and clearly it's worked in other countries. But we also have to a degree recognize that I just don't think it would be politically feasible in this country, no matter how much we tried to sell it as a panacea against the virus. So one of the things that we're talking about, or one of the pre-existing conditions that I kind of want to highlight here, I argue regionalism has come to the forefront as part of America's response to coronavirus. And it is important to understand that this regionalism has existed since before the founding of the country. Your average American high school history textbooks are going to kind of paint the 13 colonies as relatively similar. But the reality is that whether we're talking religion or countries of origin or socioeconomic backgrounds, the differences between the 13 colonies were quite pronounced, and they only tended to grow and evolve in different ways as the country progressed. So I think obviously most people understand the role that slavery played in the creation of North and South divisions within American culture and political culture in particular. But those divisions were not just over slavery. There were economic divisions, there were social divisions, there were communal, even legal differences between not just the North and South regions, but individual states within those regions as well. I think it's important, and something that's really coming to the forefront in this coronavirus debate is the degree to which one of the distinct characteristics that developed as part of American regionalism was the rugged individualism of the individuals who settled the West. I don't think it's a mistake, or I don't think it's a coincidence that a large majority of the states that are seeing protests against the quarantines or state level mandates on social distancing, I don't think it's a mistake that a large number of those states are also states that would be associated with the settlement of the West, or what you would call the rugged individual American, the individual that believes that they've kind of hacked their living out of the wilderness themselves. And whether you want to talk about individual liberty or just the blue collar work ethic, there's a certain aspect of that then's kind of getting intertwined within the debate over how the nation as a whole should respond. I think there's it's almost the person that believes that, you just got the sniffles, go to work anyway, versus the person that starts to get a cold and decides to stay home for the weekend. And that same sort of differentiation between how individuals engage the coronavirus, in my mind, goes all the way back to how individuals engage settling America. A really important dynamic and component of the regional responses to a coronavirus goes back to stories of the city mouse and the country mouse. At least since I was a kid, I've always been there's always this narrative regarding differences in the United States between rural and urban communities. They can be socioeconomic, they can be racial, they can be intellectual. I mean, the differences that most Americans understand that separate city or urban dwelling from rural dwelling is pronounced. And I think both groups, urban dwellers and rural communities, are quite proud of those differences. Now, what's interesting is that they have played directly into the nature of coronavirus. By definition, coronavirus is going to impact large, densely populated areas more significantly. And one of the things that has struck me is the degree to which this is just one more kind of that's why you don't want to live in the big city, kind of response, especially from rural communities who believe that they're being held to standards of quarantining and social distancing that really should only apply to those big cities, to the people that are really having the problems, and not necessarily small communities that either haven't had infections or are having very low levels of infections. And the reality is that whether we're talking about this individual liberty versus public good dynamic, the northern versus southern regionalism, or the urban versus rural dynamic, all of these things have slowly become overlaid with the political division in the United States. And so the result is that, and for many people, it is not just a discussion of, well, this is my community and how we need to deal with coronavirus versus yours. This is a political statement about how you believe all communities like yours should deal with the coronavirus. And so I've just been struck by the degree to which, especially from a regional perspective, there's almost been a complete opposite of the coming together or the rally around the flag experience that I saw during 9/11.
Yeah, Darius, can I underline that point for you? I mean, I responded very positively when you said that the rural people, in a sense, the rural mindset, the people out, the ranchers and that sort of thing, is a different mindset than the city dweller, and to expect one person's mindset to apply to the other is, it may be in the interest of safety, but it is a form of inequality. And almost nobody has underlined that as understanding the reason that these people are out in the streets, like demanding that their jobs open up and stuff like that. But I salute you for that. That was a really good point. I just wanted to underline.
What strikes me is, and I lived in Nebraska for 8 years, and now living in Missouri, I live in a somewhat rural area as well. And now, to be fair, I absolutely think that some protesters are just being socially obstinate or even just bandwagoning. But you can't discount the number of rural individuals in particular who see individual liberty as the direct source for their individual growth and progress. It's their ability to do what they want when they want that then serves as the foundation for their farm or their small business or the running of a local community or a church. And so for many of these people, it's a much bigger issue than simply please quarantine or please social distance. At least that's, again, the perspective I've developed. The other issue, or at least one of the other pre-existing conditions that I think has been brought out by the coronavirus here is inequality. And this is something that's obviously already been brought up. To begin with, inequality is an inherent part of the capitalist system and America's economic systems in particular. You simply cannot have success without failure. You can't have wealth without poverty. And much of the American dream is built on the premise that as long as you work towards doing the best you can with what you have, that you will succeed. Or more directly, that failure is often a product of your own inequities and lack of effort, not necessarily something baked into the system. And one of the things that coronavirus, I think, has really kind of laid bare is the degree to which there are a variety of economic and social and political inequalities baked into the system. That I think of it almost as the cascade effect of wealth. So, you know, let's use, for instance, the stimulus check that everybody got at the beginning of this month. I stopped thinking $1,200 was a lot of money at about the age of 19. Anyone who thinks that an adult with a full load of responsibilities and financial requirements is going to get through this issue, coronavirus, the pandemic, on $1,200 simply does not have a full understanding of what it required in America today to live. And the cascading effect is all of the other things that you don't often take into account that are affected by your poverty. So, for instance, I have students who the only reason they were able to go to school was because of financial assistance or loans. But as soon as they go back home, everyone had to go home because the university campus was closed. Now they have to get jobs because their parents can't support them in the same way that the campus community did. They can't, we've talked, there's a large discussion about the degree to which if you're rich in the United States, you seem to have no problem finding coronavirus tests. But the poor or the disadvantaged communities are having an increasingly difficult time getting tests, or getting really high quality care. And so one of the things that I think coronavirus has really pulled out of the narrative is the degree to, in 9/11, the poor and the rich were all Americans and we had to fight back and defend ourselves against bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The reality here is that there are some Americans that are coming to the conclusion that it's kind of every man for himself. And if you can't take care of yourself, well, then you should have gotten a job that had healthcare. Maybe you shouldn't have lived in New York City. You know, there doesn't seem to be the same impetus on the part of the average American to consider the effects, the cascading effects, especially with regards to poverty and inequality, that coronavirus is having on everyone else. And I think, one of the things that's playing out is the degree to which rural poverty, urban poverty, and the national social safety net are all being really exposed and in many ways threatened or exaggerated by the coronavirus. I mean, let's put aside for a second the astronomical unemployment numbers filings over the last month. Let's talk about the degree to which, I believe if the number is correct, there are now 3 times as many Americans who are on food services as there were 6 weeks ago. That's an astounding number. And ultimately, it really is, it's not the result of coronavirus in and of itself. It is the result of coronavirus's impact or aggregation with pre-existing inequalities in our society. And so one of the things that I'm thinking out loud here, I call it the pyramid of inequality. One of the things that struck me is that inequality, we typically tend to look at it as an individual level analysis, or at the most comparison of communities. You know, I talked about the urban and the rural communities. The reality is that one of the real stark areas of inequality that coronavirus has exposed is state-to-state inequality, and the degree to which certain states are very much recipients of federal aid versus others that are contributors. And I was frankly almost appalled at the exchange a couple of weeks ago between senators and Governor Cuomo and other individuals who were questioning which states deserve assistance, whether or not states were being honest with what they needed. I believe the president at one point suggested that individuals in certain states were stealing or hoarding medical supplies. It just seemed to me to be a degeneration of the conversation. I found myself trying to imagine that similar tone and approach post 9/11, and I simply couldn't. There was no dynamic of 9/11 that I could imagine Americans until the Patriot Act. I couldn't imagine a dynamic within the immediate responses to 9/11 that would have led to the same sort of internal recriminations that we're seeing now in America. And so it just struck me that it's not just about exposing inequality, it's about exposing it at levels that perhaps we don't always consider it. Questions, comments? Hoping I'm not putting too many of you to sleep.
Would you want to say anything about pre-existing condition, such as mindset or preparedness planning related to crisis with this? I mean, with 9/11, you know, governments react with the tools they have, and certainly there was a big military reaction. There's plenty of preparation for those type of actions by government compared to a crisis like this.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think it goes back to the understanding of the traditional threat. So just to sum up a point real quick that might be important to make here. The United States is a unique country in the world precisely because we do not have a singular definition of our national identity. Being American in many ways is simply a recognition of where you are in citizenship. It's not a definition of ethnicity or religion or language or even cultural experience in the same way as it is in almost any other country in the world. Now, the positive end of that is what we tend to call diversity or the melting pot or any number of perspectives about the diversity that makes America who we are today. The flip side of it is that one of the few things that we have been able to hold on to as defining the American experience is the military experience. Whether it's the Revolutionary War or the success of World War II or the failures of the Vietnam War, much of the American identity, both internally and externally, is wrapped up in this idea of military success and military conflict. It's kind of how we've made our bones, if you will, in the international system. And so I guess if there was a pre-existing condition, it was the understanding that the only things that are going to hurt us at that level are the physical, kind of assuming that the only injury a person's ever going to get is a broken bone, that we're never going to catch the flu. And I guess that would be a pre-existing condition, is the assumption of what actually constitutes a threat to the United States. Following up on a previous point that someone made, a third pre-existing condition, as far as I'm concerned, was the long-standing debate in American political culture between the idea of individual liberty versus the public good. And I think perhaps more than any of these other issues, this is really playing out right down at the grassroots level. Whether it is individuals who are kind of going up and confronting other individuals who are in public without face masks, or the individuals who recently went to the state courthouse in Lansing to protest quarantines with AR-15s, there have been a lot of different understandings of the relationship between individual liberty and the needs of the public or the public good. And so I guess I would begin by asking the question, or at least posing the argument that America is struggling right now with the idea of what are our rights and responsibilities as citizens during a pandemic. And I think that the existing divisions between conservatives and liberals in America really have almost fit perfectly with this question of what are my rights and responsibilities during a pandemic. And so when you combine that with the slow unfolding of the event itself, is allowed this particular debate to come to the forefront, not just as part of understanding the coronavirus as a threat, but more importantly, in understanding how we should respond to that threat. And I think I'd be lying to you if I said that I fully come down on one side or the other. I absolutely see the pandemic as a threat to national stability and to our national health, both short-term and long-term. But I'd be lying if I said I don't also see the significant, if not critical, impacts of the responses to coronavirus relative to the economics and the economic system of America. And so for me, I'm thinking balance. But it just seems that this is much more of a tug of war, and most Americans are feeling put in a position of an either or. Either it's about expressing my rights and damn this quarantine, and I'll take my chances. I mean, again, talking about one of those eye-opening moments in recent last couple of weeks, there was about a week or so where individuals, especially individuals on the far right, were arguing that as a senior conservative, as a senior citizen and conservative, if they had to die to keep the American economy going, then it was okay, and that was better than quarantining. And I've just been amazed at some of the different arguments and ideas I've seen both sides throwing out there. One of the things with regards to the public good and social rights and responsibilities, it's important to understand that there's a portion of our population who just like to be obstinate for no other reason than to be obstinate. And so I think that at least part of this is just a kind of, I'm going to do what I want. I don't even always know what right I'm expressing. I just know that the man has told me to cut it out, and I'm going to do the opposite. Maybe it's, going all the way back to rebelling against parents, but I think that's at least a part of this. And again, it's a part of it. I mean, there's no way that you're going to go against some of the policies and some of the procedures that were put in place immediately following 9/11, because, well, you could still see bodies and wreckage, and it was obvious that this was still an ongoing thing. I think people are able to be a little bit more obstinate, especially those who don't see the daily impact of this, whether they're not near hospitals, they don't know anybody that's gotten the disease, or they don't live in a city that's being impacted. I think it's just easy for them to almost say, that's a different place. And
Dr. Watson,
yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Watson, this is Dr. Friel.
Yeah.
Hey, I think one of the things that you're touching on is this grandstanding, and you've heard me talk in the past about the differences in the political parties, and that I think we've lost focus of what it means to be a Republican or a Democrat. One of the things I'm seeing is, at least in the media, is a shift to focusing more on opening up than flattening the curve. In Nebraska, there's been some conversations about where are we at with the curve. In fact, we're peaking right now from the information that I've gotten from the health systems in town. But it seems like the focus is more on how do we get things opened up rather than how do we prevent people from getting sick. So I think there is some grandstanding going on. I think there's those obstinate people out there that have nothing better to do than to gripe about their individual liberties, as you mentioned. But what do you think about that trend and where the media is going right now?
Mike, can I point of information?
You know what, Robert? I hate to interrupt you, Robert. We've got 2 minutes left. I'd like to hear from Dr.
Actually,
Watson.
I'll be on for a little. I mean, so for me, I guess, and again, this is one of the issues why I hope people appreciate that what I'm trying to do here is not just make my argument based upon one perspective or one aspect of this. So, I mean, my heart, I'm imagining that all throughout 2019, there's somebody out there that did their due diligence, getting everything in line to start their restaurant or open their new flower shop. And they were all set to do it March 1st. And so now everything's fallen apart. And I mean, to say that there's not an economic imperative would be just as unfair to say that there aren't people who are going against the rules just to be a pain in the butt. I mean, I guess that's kind of one of my points, is that the coronavirus, rather than bringing us together, seems to have in many ways exaggerated the extremes. And when you combine that with just how different the experiences are, one of the things, a lot of people keep talking about flattening the curve. And I think one of the dynamics that people have missed is that there's a difference between flattening the curve and shrinking the curve. And if you don't hold these things in line, you can flatten the curve simply by extending it. And so that now we're going to have more and more infections over a longer period of time. rather than having them all bunched up at one time. And so I guess, and this seems to be a concern of quite a few people more knowledgeable on this than me, that now there's questions about whether or not we'll see a second spike in the fall, how we'll deal with a potential long-term back-end curve for coronavirus while dealing with the coming flu season this winter. So one of the things that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention here is the numbers. It is, I just, the way people have been throwing around numbers, talking about the dead and dying from coronavirus like we're stacking wood has just been horrendous at times. I don't know the number. I don't know if there's a number below which, if we know that there's only going to be 150,000 deaths over 2 years, we shouldn't have done anything. But if there's 150,001, then we definitely should have done this, this, and this. There's no number. And when you combine that with some of the other things I've talked about, people, I think, have begun using numbers in lieu of the truth or a deeper understanding or a deeper knowledge of what's going on. And it's really, unfortunately, I think what it's done is it's harmed the role of science in this entire process. Now, predictions and projection models, which in almost every other instance would be valuable tools, are being dismissed by half of Americans because they believe ultimately they're being produced political rather than scientific means. And so, again, to me, one of the interesting things that's really been brought out, one of my students actually this term wrote a paper on one of the great debates in political science, which was basically the debate between the role of human perception and the role of science in understanding reality. And I told her, go ahead and do the coronavirus, because that's exactly what we see playing out here. How much should we understand coronavirus by the science of it? And how much should we understand it by our perceptions, our perspectives, our community needs, and overall our culture? And I think that that dynamic is really played out to an interesting way when it comes to individual liberty versus the public good. Questions? So I thought a lot about this last pre-existing condition here. I really, really, really want to avoid a knockdown, drag-out fight over Donald Trump for a variety of different reasons. But at the same time, there's no way I can talk about this without talking about Trump, what I call the Trump factor. Before coronavirus, and especially throughout the coronavirus response, I think there has to be one truth recognized by both sides. This is about Donald Trump's reaction to and leadership during coronavirus. No one, in my mind, is looking at this from a truly national perspective. There might be a secondary level where people are judging the leadership of their state or even local community representatives. But in terms of our understanding of, is the CDC doing what it's supposed to do? Has Congress responded the way it should? Have we engaged international sources of response and mitigation? All of these things seem to be coming back to Trump specifically as the leader of those processes. And the reality is that I think that's what he wants. And I think that he's both benefited and been hurt by it, in much the way that, his administration has been both hurt or buoyed, depending on how you view him, for the last 3 years. The difference in my mind, however, is that this is an all-consuming topic. When we were talking about like impeachment or the killing of the Iranian general in Iraq, there were multiple other issues going on at the same time that at least allowed us to take a comparative assessment of what we saw as Trump's role in the response or the lack of the response or the success or the failure, whatever it was. I think quite directly because of Trump, because of the way that he's wanted this to be promoted, see the daily coronavirus briefings. I think it's been very important for him to be seen wholly as the leader. And that really is personalizing this on a level, I would argue, even more than, for instance, Obama dealt with regards to national health care. The personalization of the response to coronavirus, and specifically the linking of a response to Trump as the leader, is going to be the fundamental and primary issue that all of America has to confront in the 2020 election. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, I think the primary issue is going to be, how did he do with coronavirus? And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think in the end, that's something that has to be understood with regards to examining leadership during this. And when I look at congressional leadership, I think obviously Congress is absolutely being undermined by the political divisions in America, not just obviously between liberals, conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans, but between the two houses, between the Senate leadership and the House leadership. And so when you combine that, there's always a traditional sort of tension, if you will, that the Congress has to deal with in these moments of threat and national emergency. And that tension exists relative to time. Time versus oversight. Something has to be done, but we want to make sure that we are still being beholden to and recognizing the requirements of our political duty or responsibilities. And so, for instance, the rock and the hard place that Congress had to engage from 9/11 was supporting the invasion of Afghanistan, followed by the Patriot Act. And the rock was, well, we need to respond immediately and directly to the 9/11 attack. But the hard place was, how do we balance that response to things like individual liberty, protection of privacy, and ultimately not getting the United States engaged in entangling situations around the world. I think that it's not too different of a situation for Congress right now. I mean, I think if you look at the way in which the stimulus discussions have rolled out, Congress is really having a hard time understanding what its rights and responsibilities are versus its relationship, whether it's with Trump's leadership or the upcoming national election. I think if it wasn't for Trump personalizing the national response to coronavirus, Congress would be getting just absolutely murdered right now for a lack of response, or at least a lack of a coherent and organized response. I think one of the things that we are not discussing in the least right now, but that will in fact be a significant impact, is the international perspective, especially with regards to leadership. During the 1990s, late 1990s into the 2000s, an increasing rallying cry that you heard from a lot of Americans is that we're not the world's policemen. Well, I think coronavirus has kind of led us to make sure the United States knows that, or that the world knows that we're not the world's doctor either. And it's been kind of eye-opening to see the complete lack of leadership by the United States in relation to the international system and our allies in particular, so whether it's Europe or individual allies in Africa or Latin America. The United States is just nowhere close to taking a leadership position. In fact, not only have we not taken a leadership position, we've gone out of our way to attack the World Health Organization. I am not suggesting that they are a perfect organization. What I am suggesting is at this critical moment, leadership often focuses on what we can do to improve things, not immediately going to find the sources of the failure. And so that kind of goes back to my original point that we're already looking for who to blame before the event's even over. And the adversaries component of the international system, the number of things we are not engaging right now would probably startle most people. I don't know if people are aware that we've had multiple soldiers die in Afghanistan in the last couple of weeks. 3 or 4 soldiers died in Afghanistan. There's been significant upheaval and disruption in Iraq to the point of they're concerned over an outbreak of another civil war. All this while ISIS is regaining strength in northern Iraq and Syria. The number of issues that technically we should be dealing with, but we are either choosing not to or can't, is significant. And to everyone else, it's just kind of like, good luck. I mean, if you look at the way in which technology unfolds in other regions aside from the United States and Europe, there's always a 12 to 18-month lag in when something affects the first world versus the second versus the third world. And so I don't think we fully understand how much the coronavirus is going to impact economies and societies around the world, from decreased economic activity to increased political instability. I think that just about the time the United States is getting over things, we might see some real problems in other areas. Yes.
I'd like to challenge that, at least part of that statement you made about the coronavirus has hampered our ability, our ability as empire to conduct our world affairs. It's having no impact on the siege warfare that we're conducting against countries like Venezuela, things like that. It's bipartisan, by the way. So it hasn't hampered our pernicious influence on the world one bit. And that's not Trump's fault either. The Democrats are full behind it.
No, I need to be clear that I don't think the U.S. Retreat from world leadership is a new thing by any stretch. I actually would argue that it began. In some articles that I've written, I argue that one of the first chinks in the armor when it came to the United States really questioning whether or not we would commit to this was the Bosnian War, followed by Somalia, by the Black Hawk Down incident in particular. And I think you start to see a real withdrawal from world leadership starting at about that point. It's then massively increased in its intensity following 9/11, and then ultimately, in many ways, I would argue that, and I agree with you, Donald Trump did not start the retreat, but he has certainly.
I'd love to debate you on that, but it's for fear of getting off topic, I won't. I disagree strongly, and I'm not being argumentative. I just don't
disagree strongly that with what?
Well, that we've withdrawn from world affairs. I mean, a lot of our stuff happens, surreptitiously under, sub rosa, so to speak.
Yes and no. I guess I'm thinking, when I think of U.S. leadership, I think of post-Cold War, New World Order, American promotion of democracy, free market liberalism, American willingness to intervene in other states directly to try and promote human rights and protect political systems and allies. There was a much greater level of U.S. involvement in international affairs 20 years ago than there is today. I'm not suggesting there isn't still clandestine activity or that we're not still involved, but it certainly isn't in the form of leadership of the free world, at least not in my perspective. So kind of winding down here. Oh, geez, and I left this. I left this slide in from a previous discussion here. So I want to talk about the future and kind of start to wind things down and offer time to discuss and talk about things. As I suggested, I think coronavirus has fundamentally altered the landscape for the election 2020. So, for instance, I mean, to begin with, one of the things that cannot be stressed enough is there's no way Bernie Sanders was going to win the Democratic nomination after Super Tuesday. But he absolutely was going to use those few months between his losses on Super Tuesday and his final concession to Biden to try and promote what he saw as his platform and the platform of more socially minded individuals or progressive minded individuals in America. That opportunity was absolutely lost. And so one of the things that's interesting to me is how much Bernie Sanders supporters and even supporters of other candidates will be able to bring themselves back into the fold, especially if, for instance, there's no national convention, which is still a possibility. And so election 2020, in my mind, has really been thrown for a loop. And one of the things, I say nothing before coronavirus matters. And I say that thinking in terms of everything from impeachment to Middle East policy to Trump's policy to North Korea. I'm not seeing a lot of reasons. I'm not seeing a lot of reasons to think that we're going to suddenly start bringing those things back up in the heat of the election. But perhaps even more important here is it's not just what we're doing about coronavirus now. I think the number one issue for the 2020 election is going to be coronavirus recovery and who has a better plan for recovery. And so I think what you're going to see is a very real evolution of difference between Trump's vision and Biden's vision of a post-coronavirus America. And in many ways, I think that's going to revolve around some of the longstanding traditional discussions about the social safety net. I mean, at some point, we're going to need to recognize that the bill, and this is if there is no other coronavirus and we recover within 12 months, the bill is still going to be astronomical and recover significant. It's going to require significant changes in the American budget and expenditures. I think you could see some sacred cows suddenly being up for considerations. You know, things such as the military budget or Medicare or Medicaid. We're going to have to consider potential cuts in areas that we've never considered before. And this is all as we work to prepare and develop our responses to the next potential coronavirus. So the prologue to the American century, in my mind, I think we're seeing a transfer. I think one of the real impacts of this, especially when it comes time to start talking about paying for coronavirus, could be significant questions about support of international aid programs and systems. It could even come down to international support for things like the United Nations or associated organizations like the WHO. And so it's not just about the end of the American century, it's about a question of what are things going to look like afterwards? And I think, one of the things that we need to consider, and China obviously is the center of a lot of this discussion, China has been a net exporter of medical supplies for coronavirus. Now, that has not been without its own problems. Questions in Europe, for instance, about the efficacy or availability of materials from China. But China has been exporting equipment and personnel to countries around the world to try and help with coronavirus. Interestingly, if you compare American media to media in other parts of the world, America is one of the only countries that is really going out of its way to try and identify and then perhaps potentially punish China as the source of coronavirus. There are quite a few other countries around the world who actually see China as a potential benefactor in dealing with coronavirus. And when you combine that with China's One Road, One Belt trade initiative that they had already been engaging for years, there's at least a path through which I could see China utilizing this event as a springboard to at least challenging the United States as the leader of the free world. And I say free and somewhat in quotation marks there. So are there any questions, or is there anything that anybody would like to revisit? Bueller? Well, I would just like to thank all of you for taking the time to spend the evening with me. I know you all had great fancy parties and things to go out to and chose to stay in with me. I really do hope you enjoyed this. I did. It gave me a lot to think about and a lot of reason to continue kind of stretching my brain. And so if for no other reason, I really appreciate that. And so unless there were any other questions, I would wish you all a good evening.
Hi, Darius.
Also, go ahead.
Darius,
Yes.
I would like to just suggest that one of the many changes is going to be a further realization of the global nature of this problem and of many other problems, and that folks are going to start thinking in global terms when they talk about solving global problems and preparing for the next global crisis, which is bound to come.
I guess I want to be optimistic. I really do. But I guess from my perspective, I would ask if this isn't the sort of event to create that dynamic, then what is, short of alien invasion? Like if a pandemic, like for me, I actually went back, and one of the things that I wanted to try and get a handle on before I started, critiquing the American response to the pandemic was how we responded in previous pandemics. And if you want an interesting kind of contrast, look at the way in which the United States dealt with and developed the polio vaccine, and how the United States not just did it relative to the threat that it posed domestically, but then engaged those efforts at the international level and really promoted not just dealing with polio at the international level, but doing so from a leadership position. And the manner in which the international system responded to America's leadership in that. And so it was just, to me, really a stark contrast between that style of leadership and what we're seeing today. And I guess, I mean, you of all people know, I desperately would love to see people around the world start to focus more on our similarities and differences. But I mean, even looking at coronavirus, I mean, what's the very first thing we did was we closed off borders, and then we went from there. It's just, there are certain kind of threats, if you will, that are going to push the individual over the community in terms of importance. And I think a pandemic is clearly one of them. So as much as I would like to hope that optimistically that can happen, I'm somewhat hesitant to think it's going to happen anytime soon. Were there any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to add, I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm sorry if I'm a little confrontational, it's
No.
kind of my manner, but I appreciate the discussion, and I've really gained a lot of information, from this. I hope Madeline does more of these kind of things, because this ties into so many things. I mean, we haven't really even talked about ecology and the continuing global crisis that we're facing. God bless Greta.
There's so much. I mean, we haven't even begun to really consider the fundamental changes to our society that are coming. For me, for instance, the reality is that for most of my professional existence, the concept of online learning has been an alternative. Now, all of a sudden, there are large swaths of America that are having to come to consider the idea of online learning as the primary method of education. And there are distinct issues with that. And that's just education. I mean, I saw that there's a movie company, and I forget the name of the company. I want to say it's Universal, but during this coronavirus issue, because nobody's in one of the movies, they put out one of their new releases online. And then the movie theaters turned around and banned all Universal pictures because they said that they were promoting a different avenue of movie showing, of showing movies to customers, and cutting out the movie theaters. And I don't even, we haven't even begun to engage the lawsuits that people are going to file as they begin to question the effectiveness or the lack of response of communities, companies, individuals. I think in many ways we'll know where we'll have a much better idea of where we are this coming in another 2 to 3 weeks, once we start to get the numbers from the states that have opened early. I think if, for instance, Georgia was to experience a severe spike in either infections and or deaths, I think you would see a number of Georgians begin to consider suing the state government for not having protected them. And so I just think that this is a really odd time. It almost seems like there's certain state governments that are betting their own stability on, whether on infection rates. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people are in uncharted waters here.
Hey, Professor Watson, this is Courtney. I'm so glad I got to join from DC tonight. I was wondering, I work for an organization that supports city leaders, And one of the things that we're really struggling with is there's so much unknown. And so I work on financial stability for families, and with these shutdowns at the state level and the way that city budgets are going to just be decimated for the lack of sales tax and tourism and just people going about their lives. I'm just wondering what you would want to see cities do in this. Like, their budgets are strapped, and so what would you want cities to do in this environment where they don't have the money but there's need that is growing exponentially every day?
Well, I think going back to one of the themes, I think what's interesting is that there's a debate. And on the one hand, there's an approach that says these communities need to be prepared to take care of themselves. Whether it's a community that didn't prepare properly, or it's a community that's a net recipient, they're going to have to recognize that, some changes are coming, whether it's reductions in programs or shifts in budgetary line items. But the other end of it is, and I think this is kind of an important part of the discussion, how much should these communities, whether it's a state vis-a-vis whether it's a city vis-a-vis a state government, or a state vis-a-vis the federal government, how much should they be able to rely on that next level of government above them for assistance and support? And what you're starting to see is like this kind of comparative assessment of, well, we're going to do more than you, so we deserve it more. It was weird. I mean, you saw that playing out with regards to PPE and medical supplies, and it's only fair to assume that that's probably going to start to take place when the budgetary discussions are taking place as well. For me, I think, as bad as this is when it comes to community, especially urban communities, I think one of the sources, potentially a silver lining, if you will, in this entire dark cloud, would be the opportunity to rethink community relationships, specifically community relationships as they relate to mitigating inequality and creating community systems of response. One of the things, for instance, that people don't talk about is one of the reasons why we should be fearful of the spread of coronavirus amongst rural communities, perhaps even more than some of the urban communities, is because rural communities often lack the level of healthcare available to large cities. And so in my mind, I guess what I'd like to see is I'd like to see more private-public partnerships. I'd like to see more private-public partnerships taking place within government-supported and sanctioned frameworks, so that there's a pyramid, if you will, of relationships that support the needs of the community, so that it's not all coming down. One of the things that I think is really coming out in the coronavirus episode is that it almost always seems like there's just one organization or one hospital or one governmental structure that is being asked to carry the burden of the entire coronavirus response. And so I'm hoping maybe what we'll start to see as we deal with the postmortem of this coronavirus outbreak is an increased willingness to share the burden. But that's going to mean an increased willingness to share, the wealth amongst communities, amongst individual groups within communities. And that's, more often than not, that's the sticking point is, a lot of people talk about cooperating and developing shared understandings. But when you start writing up the bill for it, that's when, you start to get some disagreements.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question at least a little bit.
Yeah, Darius, I wanted to just hypothesize maybe two possible outcomes. One is, of course, the easy answer is if we became a totalitarian state like China, that would be problem solved. I mean, in a way, if I'm talking about, I'd rather be red than dead, as the old expression went. But I mean, that's a hypothetical possibility. Another one, which I would be more attracted to inherently, would be in the absence of any national, approach to the thing, like a semi-totalitarian approach, we may find sort of like almost a medieval city-state kind of thing, where certain individuals or organizations like Jefferson City, I mean, our demographics look really good. Healthcare to population. We could kind of start pulling off from the main grid in a strange way and become our own little enforced duchy, if you want to talk about it. I'm just like spitballing here, but I think we need to like look at all the ideas that are lying around, as
Right.
you know, Milton Friedman used to say.
Well, I guess I would start by arguing I don't see any major restructuring of American political culture or systems anytime soon. Certainly not in my lifetime. Um, I think, you know, a lot of people like to talk about failures and mistakes and issues associated with the American political system. In my mind, the fact that no matter what's happened or what's going to happen, I can count an election every 4 years and I know my vote counts on some level, that in and of itself is proof that our system deserves a lot more accolade than perhaps it gets sometimes. I think without a doubt, I think what we're going to see, however, is an increasing level of regionalization within the United States. So I would draw your attention to the degree to which there are at least three, perhaps more by now, small regional groups of states who are coordinating their reopening amongst themselves. And I think that will become a trend on an increasing number of issues in American politics, where states who believe they have similar interests or perspectives, or to be perfectly frank, voting populations, are going to start to coalesce around certain national policies or initiatives more than other states. And I think that I think what's really important is to understand that, at least to a degree, the national response to coronavirus, particularly the differences across regions in responding to coronavirus, is going to set precedents. It's going to set precedents not just in response to the next coronavirus, but other potential threats. I think you'll start, whatever we come out of with coronavirus and understanding the relationship between regions, I think that'll in turn, for instance, begin to trickle down to how we understand responsibility towards regions that are impacted by tornadoes or natural disasters. And so I guess in the end, one of my main concerns is that coronavirus is going to further divide us. You know, that's I'm hoping that whoever the next president is, they see it as an opportunity to build national consciousness, not separate us according to region or need. Any other questions or comments? Well, folks, again, I really appreciate you all taking the time. I have to say just how absolutely giddy I am to have Courtney, a former student of mine, who's now making me feel really old, have been a part of this. That's just awesome. My sister, my dad, I had all sorts of people log in. So it's really a special event for me. Again, thank you very much. Everybody, stay healthy and stay safe.
Thank you so much. Yes.
It was a pleasure. You guys have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darius. God bless.
Yes.
Have a good night, everyone.
Night.